Yeah, thank you, Akadi, for the introduction. So good afternoon, colleagues. I would like to thank Gail and colleagues, organizers for the kind invitation to the DAP 12. So unfortunately, I couldn't join in person due to some administration and teaching duties. So today, I would like to take this opportunity to share with you some of our recent computation and modeling study, trying to reconcile a few important features of circuit neuron dynamic at the resting state and evoked state, and using a nonlinear excitation-inhibition balanced network model working at the critical state. So the work was mainly done by two postdocs, Dr. Yang and Dr. Liang. They are now working in China and in Germany. So let me start with some general introduction. We know inside our brain, we have a huge network of a very complex network of neurons, and these neurons will generate these spikes and propagate the spike in such local circuit or larger network for computation and processing. So we have a huge number of over about 100 million or billion neurons, each with about thousands or 10,000 of connections, synapse connections. And the very striking is this larger network use actually a little energy, about 20 watts. I will emphasize on this energy efficiency later. So we, from physics background, naturally treat this neural network as a complex dynamical network and characterized by the emergence of collective dynamic from the elements. And I will show you that this neuron spiking can be very, very irregular, but collective dynamic can be very, very rich. So we want to emphasize here is that this complex system is a functional complex system developed from a long time of evolution. So therefore is subject to strong constraint, especially energy constraint, and also try to optimize multiple functions. So there is kind of a trade-off between this cost and the function, and such trade-off must be reflected in the network architecture, dynamic, and structure dynamic relationship. So we kind of emphasize on this cost efficiency trade-off. I think this is a also important consideration, because nowadays we are talking about developing brain-inspired intelligence or computation, but we should realize that the biological brain is highly, highly constrained to have only a little energy consumption. But the AI, for example, nowadays, training AI can consume huge amount of energy. So still also very interesting to develop cost-efficient AI computational system. So for neuron system, the energy was mainly used to generate the spike and propagate the spike in the circuit. And during this propagation, also you have like a neuron transmitter uptake and so on. So if we want to reduce the energy, so we need to have a low firing rate. Actually, neuron firing rate is quite low, only a few hertz, and on average, yeah, and also try to minimize this fiber projection length. So we have had a few projects like basing on this kind of working hypothesis, like the neural system is a trade-off between low cost and efficient function. So the low cost will have constraint on the network wiring. We want to have most of connection just to the nearest neighbors or the neighborhood. And also on the dynamic, I just mentioned is the firing should be sparse, but the connection or the neuron transmitter also is a very dynamic, and also it's kind of a transient. It's not like today we talk about the synchrony in the morning. Usually the coupling is constant, but in neuron system, the coupling is a very transient. And also such economical network architecture and the economical dynamic, they should be able to consistent with each other or support each other, because there's a lot of plasticity, like the network and structure and dynamic are co-evolution. So I think this trade-off idea is important for our understanding of the neuron biological and dynamical mechanism of the structure, dynamic, and function relationship in the neuron system, and it could also be important for developing brain-inspired computing or even hardware like computers. So following these ideas over the years, we have studied the network wiring of different species, and we found a lot of features of this cost efficiency essentially trade-off in the architecture. But today I will not talk about that part. I will emphasize that many dynamical features of the neuron circuit can be integrated by this nonlinear dynamical emergency process, and these dynamical properties are cost efficient. So here is the outline. I will, in the following, give you a brief introduction of important features in spontaneous and evoked dynamical states, and then I will show you a model, actually very generic, like local neural circuit model captures some important features, can reconcile several features of this neuron dynamic at the resting state, and also get some understanding from mini-field model. And then I will show you that this model, when you put into the response to external stimulation, can also explain several features in the experimental data. And finally, I will briefly talk about this cost efficiency. Actually, neuron circuit can use less cost to generate more useful dynamic and find a solution for cost efficiency organization. So if you pay some attention to this neuron circuit dynamic experiment earlier, people found that strikingly, the spiking of the neuron, the single neuron, is very irregular, very similar to like a Poisson process. So this CV, coefficient of variation, means the standard over the meaning is about 1. It's similar to the Poisson random process, the spike. So theoretically, how such irregular spiking can be supported, and was understood by the so-called excitation-inhibition balance. Because we have excitatory current is positive, inhibitory current is negative. If coming to this neuron, the currents are cancelled, then the neuron is driven by some fluctuation and then will self-consistently generate sparse irregular spiking. So this EI balance has been confirmed as an important feature of cortical neuron circuit, and then also a lot of experiments observe this asynchronized irregular spiking of the network. But this is not a complete story. Actually, we also have a lot of observation that although the pairwise correlation is very tiny, but many neurons can spike together, and the current not actually following the series is like a random noise. It has this kind of oscillatory property. Now I will show you later these correlations and oscillations can be reconciled. Now, due to this correlation, if you go to put, say, some electrode into the brain, you will observe this kind of splitting of dynamic neuron activation in the form of spatial temporal cascading called avalanche. And this avalanche, the size and the duration, if you go to compute the distribution, has a power law distribution. So this size and duration have different power exponent, and this exponent also follow kind of critical state relationship. And but for the earlier, the theory explained this critical state with this kind of branching process. The branching process is like nowadays we have this disease spreading, and at the critical state, one activation will propagate with another activation and conserve the size level. Then you have the critical state. But the recent experimental observation of like different brain areas and the spiking of the neuron follow this kind of a critical exponent relationship. But these exponents are not the same as the branching process. Actually, one can think of a more realistic model of neural network. You have excitatory, inhibitory population, and in 2 dimensions. Then you find that this exponent is not like a branching process. And in the presence of external stimulation, this EI balance can be maintained. Just the excitatory, inhibitory current just respectively become larger, the balance is maintained. So this is similar to this theoretical prediction by this linear response in this EI balance network. And also this critical state is preserved. Experimentally, the animal was in the resting state, in the critical state. If you give now the animal a task, for example, watching video, then this activation will be kicked away from this resting state for a while, and then this critical state will be restored. And theoretically, colleagues think that these may involve some adaptation, for example, neuron plasticity. short-term or long-term plasticity so that you can have the so-called self-organized critical state. But I will show you later that this EI balance network does not need this internal plasticity to maintain this criticality, and it's insensitive to the input. So critical state is important because from our dynamical system theory or statistical physics, we know that the critical state is sensitive to external perturbation and can give you the maximal dynamical range, like a neuron circuit, if you put it in the critical state, has the maximal dynamic range. And this different activation avalanche could be used for information representation, and this capacity is maximized. And also neuron dynamic, we talk a lot about the synchrony, but in neuron system, synchrony is not fixed, and it's very dynamic. You have a synchrony, desynchrony, and then it is the most flexible actually at the normal critical states. So this provide us kind of standing state for information process, right? So we emphasize on this irregular or cluster firing, but actually neural circuit has been known that to have a lot of oscillation, collective oscillation, like a gamma oscillation, for example, about 30 hertz. And you see in the during the oscillation, some neuron can form this synchronized clustering firing. And importantly, such oscillation frequency is very soft, actually, depending on the external signal. That in such experiment, when you change the contrast, it means the input becomes stronger, then this gamma oscillation becomes faster. And theoretically, earlier, by model of excitatory neural network, inhibitory neural network, we can already observe that the circuit can have a fast oscillation like a gamma, but the single neuron spiking can be much lower with firing rate like period. But here, the model can give periodic spiking. Another property in neuron system is it is kind of a unification of strong variability and strong reliability. So in a resting state, the child-child variability is very big because the system is in this critical and highly fluctuating state. But now if you have external signal, and then if you observe the neuron state with the repeated signal or across different child, then this variability across different child, called child-child variability, is significantly reduced. So this means your response becomes very reliable, and this can be observed in the so-called collective oscillation, like a local field potential, or in the firing of the neuron, or in the scalp, like EEG, or nowadays we have a lot of measure indirectly, the fMRI, much slower, but still have this child-child variability reduced. So theoretically, earlier, we have colleagues think that because we have a suppression of chaos, initially you have chaotic state, after stimuli you move to more regular like periodic state, or you have a multi-stability, and after the signal you just converge to maybe one attractor. And also there's a fluctuation theory like with stronger input, then this noise fluctuation becomes reduced. I will show you that the EI balance model indeed has the last property, a local random network has the last property. So I give you a very quick summarize of these very different features of neuron activity at different levels and in the single neuron or collective, and has different features. But I feel that from dynamical system viewpoint, these different features, observation from neuroscience, may come from some unified mechanism of a nonlinear circuit, and they may have a unified emergency dynamic or mechanism. So I wonder whether we can have a model that can unify these features, and whether these features are cost efficient. Yeah. So next, let me show you, yes, we can use a very generic actually model of a local circuit to explain many of these features. So this model is just like thousands or 10,000 of neurons, and we have 80% of excitatory neuron, 20% of inhibitory neuron, like in the biological case, and it's a random network with a coupling density about 0.2. It's also similar to the local neural circuit. Because it's a local neural circuit, the model will receive external input, which is modeled by are a random Poisson process. And then the coupling between the excitatory population, inhibitory, and the population, these parameters are from biological parameter estimate. Then importantly, the neuron coupling is kind of transient by the neuron transmitter. And this neuron transmitter, you will open the door and then close the door just for a few milliseconds. So for excitatory synapses like AMPA is faster. It's just 2 or 3 milliseconds to close the door. And for the inhibitory synapses here, I'm talking about like a GABA, like GABA, is slower, about 10 milliseconds. So we can write down this equation for the neuron, for the neural network. Each neuron is just modeled by this integrated and spiking neuron model. And this coupling is this kind of a transient of alpha function. And I said that the excitatory coupling is faster than inhibitory coupling. Now I put this network in putting this parameter, and I found that the network is basically in the EI balance regime, means the current of positive and negative current are largely canceled. But this parameter, this decay time of synapses, is an important parameter to control the collective dynamic. So this parameter actually can be also experimentally modulated. For example, if you go to have anesthesia, then this decay time can be longer. So now in this model, if I go to have this decay time both are slow for excitatory inhibitory synapses, then what I obtain is a kind of asynchronous state of the whole circuit. So there's no correlation between the spike if you compute. And then, but the single neuron, the current coming, the positive and the negative current, they cancel. And then you see it's a balance. But you have fluctuation. So this neuron can give a few spike and at the same time. Now, if I go to change this parameter, the excitation becomes faster, inhibition becomes slower. Then I observe very interesting self-organization of collective oscillation. Although the input is a Poisson, and the oscillation give you like about gamma oscillation of about 30 Hertz. And then during this oscillation, some of the neuron will fire together. But if you look at a single neuron, the current coming to the neuron is still balanced. And but there's a little time window. The excitation will come first, and then the inhibition will come later. So you leave this neuron a little time window that this neuron can spike. But the spiking of this neuron is very irregular. Now, if I go further to make the excitation even faster, inhibition even slower, then this time window to allow the excitation become too large. So this excitation will spread to almost to the whole network. Then the whole network become highly activated and oscillatory. So we can measure the so-called synchrony, pairwise synchrony of the two neurons, each pair of the neuron and average over the network. Then in this parameter space of excitatory synapses and decay time and inhibitory synaptic decay time. And you see there's a transition from asynchronous to synchronized state. And we also look at the irregularity of the spiking of the neuron. And by CV, you found that during this transition to synchronization, this CV is close to 1, means the spiking of single neuron looks like really just like a Poisson. So very irregular spiking and the correlated spiking can be reconciled. But in neuroscience, when people say irregular spiking, they largely say, oh, we must use the spiking rate to code information because there's no correlation. That's not true. And due to this correlation, you see this collective oscillation, you see the spectra has a peak and clearly it's a gamma oscillation. But this oscillation frequency actually depending on the external input strength, and I will show you later. And this oscillation amplitude or the peak of the power spectra also increase with the synchrony of the neurons. And then because the neurons are firing together, we can talk about this avalanche. And when we measure this avalanche, and we found that during this transition to synchronization, we have a power law distribution, or you measure the distance of this avalanche distribution from the optimal power law fitting, and then the distance is minimized. So this is evidence of a critical state. So if we put together, we see you have a synchrony, irregularity, oscillation, and critical avalanche and the transition to oscillatory activity. And in this biological regime, when excitation is relatively faster than inhibition, and we say that they all can be unified and reconciled in this model. So this was a kind of computational study, and from this we see we need a kind of EI balance in this circuit. But this EI balance has, you need this synaptic decay time, a suitable value, so that excitation inhibition forms some kind of delayed loop. And there's a little time window, a time lag for the neuron to give some irregular spiking. And because this time window is regulated by the collective oscillation, then we also have a collective spiking of many neurons to form an avalanche. But this is a kind of heuristic observation. So we wonder whether we can have a better theoretical understanding. So we later developed some mini-field analysis for this macroscopic neural network. So basically, we go to look at the mean voltage and the mean firing rate of the excitatory and inhibitory population. So you reduce this network to lower dimensional oscillator. But this is not a totally self-consistent description. We call semi-analytical because due to this highly nonlinear property, is very, very hard. Actually, we have some assumption this voltage distribution is a Gaussian, which is similar to the experimental observation in the numerical simulation. Now, with this mini field, we can have understanding. We change this macroscopic, like 10,000 neuron, just into, say, 4-dimensional or 6-dimensional, depending on how we write this alpha function, right? And then we found that this neuron oscillator has a fixed point. This fixed point is stable, is corresponding to the traditional asynchronous state. But there's a transition to oscillation through a Hopf bifurcation because the eigenvalue has a real and a complex part. The real part, when you increase the decay time of the synapses, make the excitation inhibition different, then there's a transition from a negative to a positive value. And then this imaginary part can predict the oscillation frequency like from simulation. And then this model of transition or the simulation of the collective oscillation coincide quite nicely. And this model can also understand the irregular spiking, because in the macroscopic measure, we see the spiking across this bifurcation. The model still give you very irregular spiking. But after the transition, we have collective oscillation, but we found that this oscillation frequency or the Hopf frequency is much, much faster than the firing rate of the neuron. So the neuron will only spike every a few oscillation, every like 20 oscillation periods. And so the firing is very sparse and irregular. So we found that this bifurcation point of this population model and this critical avalanche of this neuron avalanche is coincide very well. And this model can also see that this exponent in the size or duration distribution is different from this branching process, but they follow this crack noise scaling relationship. And we found this exponent can change when, for example, external input changes in this model. So that is consistent with the experimental observation that you have different exponents in different neuron circuits. So from this microscopic and macroscopic comparison, and then we understand better now earlier, the spiking network, this asynchronous state is corresponding to this field model is a stable fixed point. And then this sparse synchrony is after this transition, after this bifurcation. And this critical state is actually at the Hopf bifurcation. But the system may go to imbalanced state, like you have a very big oscillation and a very strong oscillation. And there, the balance is already broken. So we see a kind of two types of balance. You have very tight balance, or you have kind of oscillatory, like a kind of loose balance in this system that can give you much more freedom in the dynamic. So we confirm that in the experimental data, this irregular spiking and the neural avalanche can indeed coexist. So this is data from earlier in vitro neuron spiking activity from a mouse somatosensory cortex culture. And then we found that many of these trials shows this very nice power law distribution, but the spiking CV is around 1. It's always around 1 in this data. But we don't see very strong in this culture, very strong oscillation in this model, in this data. So far, I talk about this kind of resting spontaneous state. Now let me go to put the model to some additional external signal to mimic this response to external stimulation. So this is the same model. Earlier we have a background input. Now I will introduce some stimulation, a kind of a transient stimuli. And I want to emphasize that before I apply this stimuli, then this model, I can have background with different intensity. And now I found that this critical state is very stable, actually, in respect to the background input strength. So that property later you will see is also important to explain it, the experimental observation that this critical state can be preserved. So the input is very typical in the computational neuroscience that you consider a big transient, and then afterwards this input will relax to a level but larger than the baseline, but it will be smaller than this transient, because in the pathway of the input you have some adaptation, and I'm considering that this neural circuit I'm interested will receive this kind of input. Then this model is a very robust, this kind of critical property. If you consider different size of the network from thousands or to 50,000 of neuron, or if you consider different input strengths, and you see this kind of critical state is maintained and can be rescaled. Even this avalanche profile can be rescaled. So it is indeed a critical state. And here is the result to show that we can preserve this critical state. In a resting state, initially we are working in the critical state. Now when you have this transient input, the system is kicked away because you have suddenly very strong activation. And then after the external stimuli come to a higher but a stable level, and then the system will go back to the critical state if you measure this avalanche distribution. So that's very similar to the observation in the experiment that you can recover. But in this article, these colleagues explain this recovery of criticality using inside the circuit. You have this short-term plasticity of the coupling, means when you have a strong activation, then the coupling becomes weaker, and then the activation will be reduced, and that's the reason they explain. But here I do not need such a mechanism. I can also show that the EI balance is maintained as you observe in the experiment. So the excitatory inhibitory current both become larger, but the balance is maintained. It's always around 0. So this property, you can also get some understanding from the mini field, because although the model is highly nonlinear, but the mini field has a very linear response to the external input. And the interesting thing here is if you go to the parameter space, like earlier we talked about the synaptic decay time can induce a translation of Hopf bifurcation. But if you look at the eigenvalue change as a function of the external input, you found that it is very insensitive. So these external input do not induce in a suitable range, do not induce bifurcation. So that's the reason that you can have a preservation of the critical state, because if you move in this input direction, and there's no transition. But the eigenvalue of the eigenvalue, the imaginary part of the eigenvalue describing the oscillation frequency is very sensitive to the input. So the oscillation frequency in this model, the gamma oscillation, can change from like 20 hertz to 50 hertz when you change this input strength. And this is very similar to what we observe in the experiment. And I want to emphasize that this sensitivity of the frequency due to the external signal only happens basically in the critical state, because you don't see clear oscillation in the subcritical state, but in the supercritical state, the oscillation is very rigid, and the external signal only change the oscillation frequency slightly. So this is interesting because if you go to the mini-field model, you see I just showed you the real part of the eigenvalue didn't change with the input, but the imaginary part of the eigenvalue has the sensitive change with this external input. Actually, the change is most sensitive around the critical state. So therefore, you see this change of frequency is very significant. Then the next property of this evoked property is that in the experiment, we already showed the example earlier that during the resting or spontaneous state, the child-child variability of the neuron activity is highly variable. So this model initially in the critical state also show very strong variability. Now, if you put this external input, then measure this child-child variability for the given input in a repeated child, but the ongoing or initial condition are different. Then you see this child-child variability become very much reduced. And the firing rate of the neuron become higher, but also the child-child variability of the firing is called the phonon factor, also become reduced. So this is consistent with many neuroscience experimental observation. But I want to emphasize again that this reconciliation of variability and the reliability does not happen in the subcritical state, nor in this supercritical state. So only at around this critical state. So that's very, very interesting for this model to explain experimental observations. So theoretically, this field model can also give some understanding, because if we do this linear noise approximation around the fixed point, just a bit below the transition point, then you found that you can do this analysis, and then this noise fluctuation, the variance become reduced when you increase the coupling. And that explain heuristically this, theoretically give an explanation about this reduced variability in the neural response. But for the spiking property, we need to go back to the original macroscopic spiking neural network to understand. And inside there's quite some complicated bifurcation property that due to limit of time, I will not go to the details. So let me quickly put together of this model. And we see that such a very generic neural network model capture important biological features of excitation inhibition balance, capture this synaptic transient coupling, but this neuron transmitter has different time scale. And then this model can reconcile these levels, like collectively, this oscillation, like local field potential, you have oscillation, and you have this variability in the spontaneous or evoked state, or in the neuron spiking level. You have a very irregular spiking, or you have a weak correlation of the spike, and you have a scale-free avalanche. And in the evoked state, such a critical state can be preserved, but the child-child variability can be suppressed, right? And we have this semi-analytical model, which can give some understanding about this relationship between these different levels. So therefore, I think this model can be quite useful for us to say, for example, develop a larger scale model of the brain. Nowadays, in the large scale brain network study, there's a lot of work trying to develop large scale brain network model. And each brain area will have some kind of population model. But this population model we develop here can translate into these macroscopic spiking features. And we are using this model for like memory and learning. And we are trying to use this model in this workshop. A lot of also talks about machine learning, we try to understand whether this dynamic can be used for cost-efficient computation. So finally, I will take a few minutes to try to explain to you what do I mean cost efficiency. So here, I come to the so-called economy of pulse. So consider a set of neurons, and each neuron will produce a kind of irregular spiking, right? And then look at some typical time window, like 20 milliseconds, like downstream neuron can read out. Then you see we have spiking patterns. So these spiking patterns, in principle, can be used for information representation. Then we can have this representation capacity measured by entropy. But remember, for neuron to generate a spike, you need to consume energy. So here I call the energy for generating a spike is 1 unit. Then there's a biological parameter of how much of this energy. And actually, when a neuron is not giving a spike in the resting state, you also need the supporting energy. It's about 5 or 10% of the spiking energy. So therefore, to generate a sequence of this spiking pattern, you need this budget to the resting state and also to the budget of a spiking state. So then we follow this earlier literature, we consider this energy efficiency is the outcome of the entropy produced by the energy input. Then theoretically, we can consider, say, binary coding means while maybe the neuron can generate 3 spikes, but only basically the first spike is important. This can be true because in neuron system, you have the so-called short-term plasticity. The first spike is important. The second is not inducing very strong input to the other neuron. And then you can write down this optimal energy efficiency formula for a given activity level law. Or we can really consider this analog. So 3 spikes can be really important than just 1 spike. And then we can have a similar formula. So theoretically, now we can plot this optimal energy efficiency of neuron representation as a function of this activity level law. And you found that there's an optimal value for different parameter R. This parameter R is the budget of the energy to the resting state, right? So if R is very small, or you can say when R is small, then the spiking will consume much energy than like the resting state. So in this case, the neuron system do not generate large spike, and the firing rate is low, and the efficiency of single neuron spike can be higher. And this the same case for binary and the analog case. Now, for biological parameter are about like 5%, 10%. So from this analysis, you see the firing of the neuron is about around 1 Hertz, which is overall consistent with the neuron data. But this is theoretical upper bound, because a real neuron system cannot obtain this maximal entropy because there's a constraint. Now I go back to the original model. Remember in the EI balance model, in the parameter space of decay time, there's a unification of irregular spiking, oscillation, avalanche. And I found that in that biological regime, the spiking of the neuron or the energy is minimized, but the energy efficiency is maximized. And then this is the plot to show energy efficiency is higher, but the energy cost is minimized for both binary and analog case. So this is not simply just the entropy divided by the rate. Actually, there's 2 things competing. One is this bursting, which will consume more energy and also have different neuron representation. And another thing is that when you increase the sequencing, you also change a lot of these neuron representation. So we go to estimate the constraint or the contribution of this bursting and sequencing to reduce the representation efficiency from the theoretical upper bound. And we found that at the critical state, this reduction is minimized. So this means that in the critical state, the model is the most similar to the theoretical upper bound, and that's the finding. And then this model also with this weak correlation can generate a large number of many neurons to spike together, and that is also followed very closely this experimental observation that I showed you in the very beginning. So let me quickly summarize to talk about the effect of topology. So in neuron system, you have this kind of Coulomb structure. This means the neuron in the two-dimensional space is not uniformly distributed. So I want to know whether this kind of modular architecture have consequence on this neuron spiking. And so therefore I have this model with neuron spread in a two-dimensional, not uniform, but initially I start from a random network. It's not constrained by the spatial connection, but a sparse random network. Then you find that this network is at this asynchronized state with high firing rate about 20 Hertz. But the wiring of the network is very big because you make a lot of long range connection and not restricted by space. Now, if I cut this long range connection, put into this local cluster of the neuron, then you get this modular network. So the wiring becomes much smaller. And the interesting thing is that the firing rate also decreased. I don't change anything, just change the network topology. So the firing was changing from an asynchronized state, but a very high rate, to such correlated firing, but with much lower rate of 1 or 2 Hertz. And the interesting thing is that the dynamic now moved to the critical state. And if you have an external perturbation, very weak, the original irregular network will generate only local activation. But if you move to this modular network, you can generate very big activation, although the firing of the network overall is much smaller. So you actually get a more useful dynamic. So this can be understood from this network like a topological correlation, where you increase the local density, then the neuron have common neighbors, then the firing become correlated, and with correlated firing, the neuron can spike much more easily. So overall rate can be reduced. So theoretically, we can use our beam field model, and when we change the coupling in a local circuit, then we can explain most of these observations we have. So overall, we see when you have a much less wiring cost, much less firing cost, but the dynamic will move to the critical state, can give you much sensitive response to external signal. So that's what we call less can be more. So I come to quickly summarize that in the neuron circuit, you have a lot of constraints. You want to have low firing rate, have a denser local connection to save energy, but you want to have a network dynamic that can respond to external signal very sensitively, have high information capacity, and so on. So we found that this can be realized with a typical local neural circuit of EI balance. Individual neuron can be very irregular, but many neurons can spike together, and you have collective oscillation. So biologically, because you have this EI balance and you have dense local network, you also need these synapses coupling to have different time scale, so that you have a self-organized delayed inhibitory feedback and Hopf bifurcation, and overall the system can give you useful dynamic with very little cost. So here is the related publication, and I think I don't have time, and I will skip this further application. For example, apply this model for information decoding, coding in machine learning, and use this model to study memory learning, and even rescue memory by stimulation to recover this EI balance. So thank you for this attention. Yeah.
So thank you, Changsong. We have time for 1-2 questions. Maybe I ask Changsong. So you showed that situation close to Hopf bifurcation is good for avalanches and for criticality, as far as I understood. Is it related to this particular model or for other neural systems where in the mean fields Hopf bifurcation is possible, you will expect similar things? Or is there some kind of particularity of this model?
Yeah, in this model, it's quite generic, but for this model, we found that the inhibitory synaptic decay time should be slower than the excitatory decay time. So this is a in the neural circuit when it's a GABA is slower than this AMPA. But we do have neural circuit where the excitatory synapses, for example, NMDA is slower. Then in that circuit, then you will only have asynchronous state.
Okay.
So depending on different neural circuit and the different neural transmitter, the system or the circuit may work at different diagram of this model.
Okay, so now I asking you to look on the screen. There is a question in the chart. What conditions are necessary to maintain excitatory inhibitory balance? How do real neural networks maintain it?
Yeah, so earlier Syria in the EI balance was using this easy model. Already can lay down some of these conditions that you really need to have some condition on this. Do I see that this kind of coupling? Actually, you need some constraint on this like coupling to the excitatory population and then coming back from inhibitory population. There's some constraint. Otherwise, this so-called fixed point is not does not exist. So that's if we look at this parameter we get from biological system, and then they actually fulfill that kind of requirement of EI balance. Yeah.
So I don't see further questions from the audience and also not from the online participants. So thank you, Changsong, again.
Everyone, yeah. I think Sherry and allow Yami to come.